On the Stratfor Global Intelligence website, they have put out a video that is free, that's by George Friedman and Robert D. Kaplan on U.S.-Iranian relations. And just a highlight of it, it says, Stratfor's George Friedman and Robert D. Kaplan discuss now a possible warming of relations between the United States and Iran could affect the Middle East and beyond. And in a second I'm going to show you what the video is, and you're going to be able to view it. It is a free video, and basically usually when Stratfor, they'll allow you to use their stuff, but you have to give them credit for it, and that's what I will do. Hopefully what I'm going to do in this video is enough to satisfy Stratfor, but I will also point you to the video on their website as well. It will be on the video itself and also in the description box. So I encourage you to go to Stratfor.com and look this video up. It's right on the front page, and view it if you don't do so on my screen in just a second. But just to give you a synopsis of what they're talking about, they are going to discuss what will happen in the coming months and how this could affect the Middle East and beyond. And when I say that, I'm talking about U.S. and Iranian relations being rekindled. And I found what they had to say to be very shocking and somewhat close to what prophecy could lead to in the near future. And also to any of my readers, if you can afford it, I would encourage you to get a subscription to Stratfor Global Intelligence. They're very adept and intelligent in the world of global military intelligence. And surprisingly, I think is without knowing, they are fairly close to what I believe will happen in Bible prophecy. And one example is that they will say in the closing remarks that they believe that what will happen between the United States and Iran could bring about a more dangerous Middle East, and that the rekindling of relations between the two countries could be a very dangerous endeavor. And frankly, I do believe that is exactly what will take place as time goes on. But they mention a few other interesting facts that most prophecy website and channels would not pick up unless they had this type of report. Now here is the report.
My name is George Friedman, and I'm here with my friend and colleague Robert Kaplan, and we want to talk about what for us is even more interesting than the shutdown of the government. We want to talk about Iran, the United States, and the possibility of a rapprochement. From where I sit, somebody who remembers Richard Nixon's trip to China, we saw a massive reversal of alliances and relationships then, when the unthinkable happened, and China and the United States aligned against the Soviet Union. It's not clear that what's going on in Iran is going to work. It's not clear that we're going to have a rapprochement, but things have begun. And it's an interesting time for us to think about this question. Let's assume that this works. Let's assume that there's a rapprochement between Iran and the United States. What will the Middle East look like then? That's something worth thinking about, both in terms of evaluating this effort and maybe being a little concerned about it. Robert, what do you think happens?
Well, I think first of all, in any sort of rapprochement, the U.S. has to essentially agree to or legitimize Iran's strategic interests. That means a Western Central Afghanistan that is an Iranian sphere of influence. It means in Iraq, where there's a soft Iranian sphere of influence in Mesopotamia. It means that Assad stays in power. We do not topple him or bomb him. It also means that there's probably what the Iranians will give is less pressure against Israel from southern Lebanon in terms of Hezbollah and from Hamas from Gaza to the degree that they can influence.
And of course, it means the end of the bomb.
Yes. It means the end of the Iranian bomb, but a nuclear Iran in terms of its capacity to produce nuclear energy for civilian medical purposes and others. Now, it's probably bad news for Saudi Arabia. This is remember when the U.S. and China got together, there was a common enemy, the Soviet Union. But in this case, it's more diversified. It's not as clear-cut cut where there's a common enemy that both have. But on the other hand, the U.S. is essentially allied with Saudi Arabia and tilted against Iran for many decades. There was a point during the Cold War when both Iran and Saudi Arabia were U.S. allies, but that was under the Shah, who is a secularizing leader who did not promote Shiite identity as much as secular ancient Persian identity. So he was less of a threat to Saudi Arabia. This time it would be different. This is probably the Saudis' worst nightmare, a true U.S.-Iran rapprochement. And then the Saudis look at themselves, diminishing water table, 40% male youth unemployment, a royal family not as centralized in the past due to power passing to larger numbers of grandchildren, and they get extremely nervous.
For the United States, there's a benefit and a risk. The benefit is that there will be a regional balance of power where various powers will contain each other. The risk is that after the agreement, Iran won't be contained. When you give the Iranians influence, particularly in Iraq, if they move and try to consolidate that, they're in an extremely powerful position. It's one thing to balance Saudi Arabia off against Iran.
And Sunnis versus Shiites.
But the problem with any balance of power theory is that sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes you wind up in a situation that is worse than before. So I'd like to hear you kind of evaluate what the risks are and what the possible outcomes are.
All right, what the Iranians want is the American legitimization of an essentially greater Iran or soft Persian empire, very similar, geographically speaking, to Medes, Parthian, Sassanid, Achaemenid Persian empires of yore, which stretched essentially from the eastern edge of the Mediterranean to the confines of Central Asia, where the Iranians would be the top outside power in the region in Syria, in what's left of Syria, Iraq, and into Afghanistan. Now, the danger of this is that Iran could build on this rapprochement or this legitimization from the United States to become a regional hegemon. That would then lead to an imbalance of power. Because think of Iran as a regional hegemon, but a weakening or Saudi Arabia undergoing its version of an Arab Spring. Just because it hasn't happened yet in Saudi Arabia doesn't mean that it won't. It just means it may be a more circuitous path towards an uprising of sorts in Saudi Arabia. And given that Yemen is in a state of quasi-chaos for years to come, this impinges on Saudi Arabia in a very negative way. Given that the Sultan of Oman is getting old, it's unclear about the future. Saudi Arabia is an artificial state to a much greater extent than Iran is.
But really, the question that we're looking at is, are there limiting factors on Iran? So if we look at this and say, well, if we give these concessions to Iran strategically, there is nothing to limit it because Saudi Arabia is weak.
And getting weaker, probably. Syria's in chaos.
So we have to talk about another country that isn't usually mentioned in this context, and that's Turkey.
Yes.
Turkey, a close ally of the United States. Turkey, a country that is developing into a serious power, but is having serious internal questions. When I look at this just as kind of an exercise, intellectual exercise, the balancer to Iran would be Turkey. Not because Turkey wants to balance Iran, they don't, but because once you've created this dynamic, Turkey must limit, Iran's power. Therefore, one of the questions that has been raised really is, what does Turkey think about all this? And the answer seems to me that nobody's consulting them, and they must be extremely nervous because they're trying very hard not to be drawn into roles that they're not ready for. What's your view on that?
I think that, first of all, Turkey has tried to be a regional neo-Ottoman power, and it thought it could do that by arranging a ceasefire or a regime change in Syria, or to be a major player. In Syria, it's come upon the limits of Turkish power, because Turkey is bedeviled by its own Kurdish problem, which complexifies its ability to project power into Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And the Turks see that they don't have the capacity to change things in Syria. So I think the Turks have grand visions, but they're rubbing up against reality. They may have a large standing army that's the largest in NATO. What does that mean? What does that actually get them in Syria?
I think the way I would answer it is Turkey is going to be a great power. That doesn't mean Turkey is a great power. And right now it's in a gap between attaining this. And the other country that we really need to think about is Russia.
Yeah, Russia, and we also have to talk about Israel for a moment.
Let's begin with Russia.
Okay.
And in the case of Russia, Russia has been very happy since 2001. The United States has bogged itself down in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Clearly the Russians wanted us to get more deeply engaged in Syria. It has a close relationship, or as close a relationship as it can have with Iran. Rapprochement between Iran and the United States would mean that the United States has no military commitment in the Middle East, or minimal military commitment, and therefore is free to address the Russian question. This the Russians don't really want, so we can expect them to try to interfere.
The Russians will try to interfere because they want us bogged down in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere. They don't want us offshore just in our naval ships with an agreement with Iran, with an understanding with Iran. Because the U.S. and Iran automatically balance against Russian encroachment into the Middle East. So I think the Russians will do everything they can behind the scenes, not officially, to disrupt this U.S.-Iranian rapprochement.
Which is delicate enough as it is. So
exactly.
So then let's consider, the one we've left out, Israel.
All right.
What do they do?
Israel's future is gray and bleak, not black, but just gray and bleak. Because a rapprochement will leave in Iran with nuclear power, but not a nuclear weapon. And yet we can put in all the safeguards we want, but building a nuclear weapon is always possible, provided one has the research base to do it, and the human talent in terms of engineers and others to accomplish it. So Iran will always be like the person with an empty whiskey glass, but with whiskey in the other hand and ice in the glass, able to pour it at will at some point with a So Israel will always be nervous of this into the future, and therefore, this will lead Israel to, I think, move even closer to Saudi Arabia, though this is the alliance that exists but cannot ever be spoken out loud.
Never mentioned that the two countries are close, but there's another dimension to this, and I think it's important to look at. I'm less concerned about nuclearization of Iran, but the fact is that what the United States is trying to do here is execute a withdrawal from the Middle East. That if it reaches an entente with Iran, it will have sufficient balance that it can not just move forces out of the area, but reorient its foreign policy away from it. And this represents a fundamental threat to Israel. Yeah. In the end, the United States is the guarantor of Israeli national security, which is not particularly threatened right now. But Israel's national security needs are too large to be satisfied by its industrial base. It needs the United States.
And the last thing it wants is to see more U.S. warships in the Pacific or elsewhere, rather than in the confines of the Middle East.
And Netanyahu, very clearly in his visit, didn't feel that he could try to undermine the opening. At the same time, I think he's very clearly rooting against it. There's a lot of people rooting against this.
Going back to your China metaphor, Israel, to a much lesser extent, is in the situation of Taiwan watching this. Because remember, imagine if you were in Taipei looking at Nixon clinking champagne glasses with Mao and Zhou and Lai. Again, it's not an accurate metaphor, but it gives you a sense of how isolated.
Taiwan did pretty well
out
of that deal. And it's not clear that Israel not entering the mix of the regional balance of power is in Israel's favor, or that it can simply solve its problems militarily. As we said, look, the Saudi-Israeli relationship is very private and very close. They have common interests, and they execute these common interests. They talk all the time. Israel is in the position to play Saudi Arabia off against Iran. It almost doesn't matter if the Iranians accept them or not.
There's one element we're leaving out, which is historically, Jews and Persians have had a rather close relationship, and Iran is not inherently anti-Israel. In fact, the Shah had an unofficial alliance with Israel up until he was overthrown in the late 1970s. A U.S.-Iran entente could lead to political changes in Iran itself over time, which would lead to an Iran that's less anti-Israel than it is now.
Also could lead to a backlash, and
could.
So
yeah.
We're moving into exotic areas. Well, this has been a great discussion, Robert.
Well, thank you, George.
And I am more confused than I was coming in here, except for the fact that I know that what is going on between the United States and Iran is potentially very important. It will change the region, and it could make it far more dangerous as well as far more pleasant than it is now. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Robert.